Thank you very much. Thank you very much. There we go. Thank you very much, Edwin, and good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be back here at the law faculty and at the university to share some insights and some progress on what we've been doing since Paris to advance the global agenda on responding to the challenge of climate change. Well, as you all know, less than a year ago today, we adopted the Paris Agreement, the first internationally legally binding and comprehensive effort to respond to the challenge of climate change, not just in terms of reducing emissions, but also putting in place, helping countries to put in place the policies necessary to prepare for the impacts of climate change or adaptation, as well as putting in place obligations and procedures and institutions that will help, particularly the poorest and most vulnerable countries, fund both the reduction of emissions as well as preparing for the impacts of climate change. So this is a very significant event in agreeing this new international treaty, and it was a real landmark in terms of the work that we've been doing over the years. It is the result of more than 25 years of international negotiations that began back in the early 1990s, before many of you in this room, I assume, were born. And it started with the first framework convention in 1992, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which contains a general set of principles, some institutions and procedures, but is, just as its name suggests, merely a framework. It doesn't give a clear direction as to what individual parties, countries, should do to respond to climate change. What it does contain within is an obligation to continue negotiating, to try to strengthen that set of principles and to articulate more and more specific obligations over time to ensure that we do stabilize greenhouse gases in the atmosphere at safe levels. From that procedural obligation to strengthen over time emerged a second generation of climate change agreements in 1997, the Kyoto Protocol. The 1997 Kyoto Protocol took a different model from the Framework Convention. It was supposed to be much more targeted, much more specific, much more prescriptive in what countries were required to do, and it contains legally binding targets and timetables for countries to reduce their emissions between the period of 2008 and 2012. Legally binding targets and timetables. Those targets and timetables, as many of you know, however, applied only to industrialized countries, so they didn't capture the entirety of global emissions, just the wealthier countries that were willing to sign up to it at the time. And they did not include some of the wealthier countries that were not willing to sign up to the Kyoto Protocol at the time, most importantly and notably the United States. But that was our second effort at trying to design an international legal regime to respond to the challenge of climate change. We then took a third shot at it in 2009 to 2011 by approaching this from a more voluntary or bottom-up way. So still operating within the Framework Convention on Climate Change, there were a series of pledges that were made in Cancun and Copenhagen, where countries essentially went back home and looked at what kinds of policies they could pull together to contribute to the challenge of climate change, but just kept them as voluntary pledges with a light review or transparency system over top of them. We made that effort. That effort is still ongoing. That basically will take us from where we are now up until 2020. The Paris Agreement is the most recent generation, the most recent effort at negotiating the climate change treaty. And what it essentially does is combine those different experiences, the top-down approach that we took with the Kyoto Protocol, with a more bottom-up approach that we tried to use in the context of the Cancun, Copenhagen pledges. I think it's this combination of what people refer to as top-down and bottom-up that really led to the success of Paris. A new, as I said before, legally binding treaty, but that is for the first time inclusive. It doesn't just cover industrialized countries in terms of what it requires, it covers the entirety of the international community, and that was made possible by the fact that we followed the bottom-up approach in terms of what it was that specific countries would do to try to achieve the goals set for the international community in the Paris Agreement. These individually determined targets that we have in the Paris Agreement are referred to as nationally determined contributions, a term that is expected to reflect that these are domestically driven commitments. They're things that aren't negotiated at the international level, but rather emerge from an inquiry about what each country feels it can do within its powers, within its capacities, within its politics at the moment, that is as ambitious as possible in contributing to the Paris Agreement goals, but still are nationally determined in their nature. This technique, and I know we'll hear more about the specifics of NDCs in a moment, really unlocked two essential elements of the climate change politics. One was the element of sovereignty. There are still many countries that are very nervous or unwilling to have the international community negotiate collectively targets that will be then assigned to them in a binding nature. But it also solved the problem of diversity. The fact that we're trying to get over 180 countries into this umbrella of climate change obligations, and to do so, we have to design a regime that reflects their very, very different national circumstances. You know, countries that range from the world's largest emitters, the United States, China, the European Union, to the world's smallest emitters, including the smallest island states and least developed countries. In order to capture them all into a single system, you have to allow a degree of self-determination in terms of what it is that they're willing to do. That combination of unlocking the sovereignty question and the diversity question helped us to move beyond some of the very rigid structures that we had in the Framework Convention, which solved this issue of diversity, as I described before, under the Kyoto Protocol, by dividing countries into very binary categories of developed and developing. So now we have a much more inclusive, a much more universal regime, one that's designed on the basis, as I said before, what it is that each country has identified for itself is its most ambitious contribution to this challenge. And as a result, I think that most countries came away from the Paris Agreement, most leaders came away from the Paris Agreement proclaiming it as a great success. However, those of you who study the Paris Agreement, those of you who care about the issue of climate change, which I'm sure is everyone in this room, also know that the Paris Agreement has its weaknesses. If you take all those INDCs that emerged as part of the Paris Agreement negotiations, and you assume that they are fully implemented over the period of 2025 or 2030, which is the time frames in which they have been designed, scientists tell us, analysts tell us, modelers tell us, we will not be on track towards the very ambitious goals that are set for us collectively in the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement says that we need to be well below 2 degrees centigrade in terms of global average temperature rise, and we should pursue a limit of 1.5 degrees Celsius in terms of global average temperature rise. Those INDCs combined will get us on the pathway to about 3 degrees of global average temperature rise. So the national determination, the bottom-up approach, has not given us sufficient ambition in order to achieve the goals that we set for ourselves in the Paris Agreement, and therefore we've got a lot of more work to do under Paris to bring countries onto a more ambitious pathway. Furthermore, the NDCs, as I'm sure we'll be hearing a bit more about in a moment, are very diverse in their nature. There wasn't a lot of guidance that was agreed before the NDCs came out as to what exactly they should look like. So you have on one end of the spectrum, legally binding at the domestic level, like within the EU, economy-wide targets that clearly spell out that the European Union intends to be, in our example, at least 40% below 1990 levels by the year 2030. And that's an economy-wide, very precise, quantified target. At the other end of the spectrum, you would have countries that have simply made commitments of a very soft nature with regard to a particular sector. So they might say, you know, we seek to try to get our rates of deforestation under control by 2030 or by 2025. In the middle, you have countries like China that have targets that look on their face something like the EU target. They're quantified there for a particular period of time, but they're against a business-as-usual trajectory. So what they're basically saying is, well, our emissions are going to continue to grow against what we predicted that they would grow, but they would grow less than they would otherwise do had we taken no action. So you can see there's a great diversity of targets across the 180 so countries that have come forward with these nationally determined contributions, and that is a real challenge for the regime going forward, because it means that the targets aren't terribly comparable. They're hard to aggregate. I mean, that 3-degree projection that I gave you in terms of what the modelers have come up with contains many, many assumptions bundled into it. It's not a precise number, it's a guess as to where we might be if these targets are fully implemented. So there's a lot of work that we need to do under the Paris Agreement to improve the quality, the quantifiability, and the accountability of these targets if we're going to hold countries individually responsible and accountable for the commitments they're making under the Paris Agreement, but also if we understand over time, collectively, whether we're on path to the ambitious goals that we've set for ourselves. So that's what we achieved in Paris, and by giving you a sense of what went well and what didn't go so well in terms of responding to the big challenge that we set for ourselves, I can now turn to what's happened since then in terms of progress in filling the gaps that were left in Paris. Well, the first challenge, of course, was to bring the Paris Agreement into force, and that has gone extremely well. For those of you who track this issue, you know that we achieved in April of this year, when the Paris Agreement was open for signature, the most rapid number of signatures of any multilateral agreement in the history of the UN, with over 100 countries signing up to it in the early stages of its being open for signature. Signing the agreement does not bind you to it. You then have to go through the additional processes domestically of ratifying it. So your executive or your parliament has to agree to bind yourself to it. And then you, of course, have to deposit your instrument of ratification with a depository in New York. And it's only when you've done that that your ratification counts towards bringing this agreement into force. The Paris Agreement has 2 thresholds. It has a threshold in terms of the number of countries that have to ratify and deposit, that's 55. But it also has to reach 55% of global emissions before it will come into force. And as of a few weeks ago, we crossed both of those thresholds, and the Paris Agreement will enter into force on the 4th of November of this year. And that rate, not just of signature, but also ratification and deposit, is also record-breaking in terms of previous multilateral agreements in this or any other area. And so that shows, we hope, that the political commitment that we saw when leaders adopted this agreement in Paris remains, and that the momentum to bring this agreement into force and to make it operational also remains across all areas of the international community, and that's a very good sign. So success, now that it's into force, depends on basically putting in place a machinery around the Paris Agreement that will make up for some of these gaps in ambition, these differences in the design of the nationally determined contributions that I just described. So how are we going to do that? Well, the first is by really understanding and socializing, as they say now in the international negotiations, the consequences of having signed up to as ambitious goals as we had. So the Paris Agreement contains a number of ambitious goals just with regard to reducing emissions. I already mentioned the temperature goals of well below 2 degrees and in pursuit of 1.5. There's also a goal within the Paris Agreement that says that we should seek to peak global emissions as soon as possible. The peaking of CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions has already happened in many countries, including the EU in the early 90s, but also many other industrialized countries. We've peaked our emissions. But for many growing emerging economies, that hasn't happened yet. So we have committed under the Paris Agreement to peak global emissions as soon as possible. And we've also signed up to a goal, it's a qualitative goal, to seek to achieve climate neutrality or carbon neutrality in the second half of the century, which basically means, when you unpack the ambiguities in the text, that we've committed to decarbonizing the global economy, weaning it off fossil fuels, halting deforestation, stopping the leakage of methane from the production of fossil fuels, and many other goals, in order to ensure that the global economy is climate neutral by the second half of the century. And when you walk around in the world today and think about what the implications of that are, that's very profound. That's a very, very profound commitment. So understanding what those goals mean collectively and individually for countries that are still heavily dependent on every aspect of their economy on fossil fuels is something that the Paris Agreement now has to bring us to terms with. So those goals are in place. Understanding those goals is the first challenge. The second is ensuring that what commitments countries have already made, they are held accountable for. So we have to design now within the Paris Agreement something called the transparency framework. That's the monitoring, reporting, and verification system, as well as a potential compliance system that will regularly review the progress of each country against the goals that it set for itself, these nationally determined contributions in the Paris Agreement, and hold each country accountable for the targets and timetables that they've set. That's a key element, obviously, of making sure that what is now stated vaguely in nationally determined contributions becomes actual domestic policies on the ground within these countries, achieving emissions reductions over time. The third piece of the Paris machinery that we have to put in place to make sure that the agreement fulfills its full potential is something called the ambition cycle. And that's the procedural obligation that countries have signed up into the Paris Agreement to regularly take stock every 5 years of the state of the science, the adequacy of our collective performance as parties, and what needs to happen next in order to move us on to those ambitious goals that I've just described. And then, as a result of that global stocktake, to make the changes necessary in our nationally determined contributions to put us on track to those ambitious goals. This is what we call the ambition cycle. It's a regular review of the adequacy of our performance in light of the science, and an obligation to take the results of that stocktake on board as we come forward with our next commitments. For some countries that have 2025 commitments only, like the United States and Brazil, that means they will have to come up with their new targets before 2025, by 2020 in fact. And for countries and regions like the European Union and China that have targets that reach out to 2030, we will have to reflect as part of the first stocktake whether we can strengthen those targets, and then as part of the next stocktake we will have to come up with our post-2030 targets as well. And putting that machinery in place, what the NGOs like to call the ratchet, is obviously going to be a key part of the Paris Agreement living up to the ambitious goals that it has set for itself. So let me say why it is that I am optimistic that the combination of this bottom-up approach that produced the NDCs, this incredible momentum that we've seen from leaders in bringing the Paris Agreement into force, and now the work that we're doing in completing the Paris machinery on transparency and ambition is going to put us on the right path towards to respond to the climate change problem. And it's because I think that these are all evidence that we're reaching 4 tipping points that are going to be critical if we're going to actually address this problem. The first tipping point, and it's come relatively recently, believe me, having been in this process for a while, is a political tipping point. The idea that no leader that's elected currently by democratic processes or by other means can get on the global stage and deny that there is a problem of climate change and that each country has a responsibility to do something about it. And that was evidenced in Paris, and I think it's evidenced in many of the election cycles that we're seeing around the world today, that it's difficult even for the most extreme of politicians, and here I'm talking as an American as well as a UK politician, to openly say and sustain it over time that they don't believe climate change is happening and that we don't have a responsibility to do something. I think that political tipping point has now been reached and there's no way back. Once you say that, you then have to begin to act in accordance with it, and that's where we get to the second tipping point, which is a regulatory tipping point. As a result of these NDCs, and I'm interested to see what other colleagues say about their review of these NDCs, many of them show that the world's biggest economies now are beginning to regulate greenhouse gases for the first time. Now that generates lots of local benefits. It can improve air quality. But if you're regulating CO2, there's only one reason to do it. It's not a poisonous gas. Its main impact on the environment is as a greenhouse gas. And if you make a commitment to regulate something as a greenhouse gas, you have to carry it through to its end, which means essentially that you have to regulate so that you are decarbonizing by the second half of the century. There's no other reason to do it. And so once you reach that tipping point of beginning to regulate CO2 for the purposes of addressing climate change, you've got to carry it through all the way to the bitter end. It's not just about achieving improvements in air quality, it's about decarbonization. So that's the second tipping point, and I think we see evidence of that in the Paris Agreement, what's happened and what's happened next. The third tipping point is a technological tipping point. One of the big resistance to doing something serious about climate change is that it's simply too costly. That is no longer the case. We are seeing time and time again, as contracts are let by governments to meet energy needs around the world, that renewables, solar, wind, and hydro are out-competing fossil fuels as the cheaper option for building new sources of energy. And that technological tipping point, I think, now has also been reached and deliverable. There are many challenges left, particularly, as many of you will know, in the area of storage, to make sure that we have demand in circumstances where the renewable sources are intermittent, and we have that supply in place. But I believe that very significant technological tipping points have been made. And the fourth tipping point is one of markets and consumers and voters. I believe now that there is a significant response in the form of voters, in the form of consumers, in the form of shareholders, that are basically saying that we want products that are low carbon, we want to invest in results that are low carbon, and we want to vote for parties and politicians that support that objective as well. So that's why I'm optimistic, and that's why, as we approach COP22, the annual meeting of the Conference of Parties, and it will now turn out to be, because we have entry into force of the Paris Agreement on the 4th of November, the first meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement, something that no one would have predicted, I think, even 7 or 8 months ago. We will have a gathering, again, of world leaders, of ministers, and of negotiators in Marrakesh a few weeks from now. At that meeting, I think we'll have 3 major themes to be addressed. One is with regard to pre-2020 ambition. As I mentioned, the NDCs and the Paris Agreement for nearly all parties begin in 2020, but we have to continue to act between now and then if we're going to get our emissions on the right trajectory. And so there will be lots of conversations about what countries are doing before their NDCs kick in to ensure that they're acting to reduce emissions. The second theme, and I know this will be touched on the panel as well, is a theme of support. A recognition that now that we've moved from just a few countries undertaking commitments to all countries undertaking commitments, we have many, particularly developing and vulnerable countries out there that need more finance, they need more technology, they need more capacity building if they're going to live up to their commitments. And there will be a big focus on ensuring that donor countries in particular, between now and 2020, are living up to the very ambitious pledges that we've made to deliver more public and more private finance. And that will be a major focus of the discussions in Marrakesh. And thirdly, of course, there will be the Paris Agreement itself. There will be a lot of celebration about the fact that we brought this agreement into force so quickly. Politicians love celebrating that. So I have no doubt that there'll be lots of champagne drunk, or if it's a Moroccan-sponsored event, there'll be a juice drunk to celebrate this fact. And then, of course, there will be progress on the negotiation of that machinery that I referred to before, under something called the Ad Hoc Working Group on the Paris Agreement, the APA. There will be negotiators working in the trenches to complete the rules on the transparency framework and the ambition cycle to make sure that those are in place by 2020 when we're ready to start implementing the Paris Agreement. One last word of what's happening outside of the Framework Convention and the Paris Agreement that I think is also very important and gives evidence of these tipping points. Many of you will know that a few weeks ago, the International Civil Aviation Organization, for the first time, has agreed to put in place a global market-based measure that will essentially cap the growth of emissions from that sector from 2020 onwards. And this is one of the fastest growing sectors. As you can imagine, international aviation is growing very rapidly as emerging economies begin to move their citizens around the world. And getting those emissions under control will be critical. It's a very emergent and nascent regime, but the fact that both governments and the industry have agreed to basically limit growth in that sector through an offsetting regime this year is a very important example. I think that we've reached those tipping points that I've described. And then a week ago, we also agreed in Rwanda, Kigali, to amend the Montreal Protocol on ozone-depleting substances to include within its controlled substances a very powerful greenhouse gas, hydrofluorocarbons, that if left unregulated could have led to an additional 0.5 degrees of global warming on its own. And that we now agreed freeze dates for all countries. And and a global phase down that will lead to that particular chemical coming off the market, I think, very quickly and certainly in the next 15 to 20 years. So there's a lot that's still happening, and there's a lot of momentum out there, and I think it's for all of us and for all of you to keep that momentum going in all the ways that I described. Let me stop there, and I'm sorry if I went a little over time, but look forward to hearing the other presentations and the conversation that will follow.